This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
This is a presentation of my forthcoming book on the English workhouse, entitled La Bastille des pauvres, essai d'histoire de la workhouse anglaise du XVIIe au XXe siècle, to be published in Paris by the Éditions Vendémiaire in 2016. Let me say first why I chose what my publisher finds a ghastly subject. Most books on the English workhouse discuss the Victorian period, and I found it rewarding to look into earlier centuries. There is neither in English nor in French a general book on the long history of the workhouse covering at least 3 centuries. I chose the date 1630 to 1930 for the sake of clarity, but I could well have included part of the 16th and the beginning of the 17th centuries, and also the whole of the 1930s until the Second World War. Eventually, I chose the more precise period because the term workhouse then tended to supersede all others, and above all, because the notion of work constantly remained central to its existence. What also attracted me to the subject was the apparently paradoxical nature of this institution. Almost from its birth, it was both detested by its inmates and criticized by the elites for its cost and inefficiency. And yet, it survived for 3 centuries. Surely there must have been reasons for this. Although the structure of my book is chronological, combining a general narrative and a number of case studies on 18th century Bristol, on St. Giles in the Field in London, Bull Camp, Oxford, Shrewsbury, on 19th century Manchester, Stoke-on-Trent, on the Strand Union and the Poplar Union in London. Today's presentation will be focused on 2 broad fields, first examining principles and policies as elaborated by political elites, and secondly turning to what we can know of the experience of life in the workhouse by its inmates. I will first briefly remind you of the institutional framework of the Poor Law, drafted at the beginning of the 17th century, modified in 1834 and finally eliminated only in 1948. I will then discuss the gradual invention of specific buildings for workhouses in connection with the increasing categorization of paupers. Then I will explain how difficult it is to reconstitute the experience of life in the workhouse because of the lack of written testimonies by the poor themselves, especially for the earlier centuries. I will describe the workhouse as a community without common aims, gathering a heterogeneous set of people who were bound to have difficult relationships with authority, as well as between themselves. Still, one can manage to discover a number of things on such subjects as workhouse discipline, education, health care, and of course compulsory work, even in the context of the earlier centuries. Finally, I will discuss the meaning of compulsory labor in the workhouse. What did it consist in? What was its purpose? Did it have the same meaning before and after the reforms of 1834, a year that was a crucial turning point in this long story? First, the institutional framework. It is of course necessary to examine briefly the legislation that allowed the opening of workhouses as well as its evolution. It can reveal the perception of the poor by the ruling elites as well as their aims and intentions concerning the management of the paupers and the role of the workhouse. This is indeed what most traditional historians have done in the 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, Beatrice and Sidney Webb's English Poor Law History of 1927 provide a monumental and well-documented history of the administration of relief. Yet their dismissal of the pre-1834 workhouse as hopelessly chaotic and amateurish is misleading. Moreover, they have a teleological approach that tends to enhance what, according to them, should be done for the indigent. In the past 50 years, more attention has fortunately been given to the experience of living in a workhouse, while the question of the perceived or actual rights of the poor has also been investigated. The existence of the workhouse was made possible locally then nationally at the end of the 16th century. The term poor law designates the series of laws on poor relief that were passed between 1598 and 1601. Apart from the definition of conditions of settlement in the 1660s, this legislation remained unchanged until 1834. According to the law, parishes could organize relief if they wished to do so, a poor tax being then levied among the householders. Relief could be given outdoors, that is, in the homes of the poor, for example, under the form of small pensions for widows. Or it could be provided indoors, that is, in a workhouse, where relief was offered in exchange for work. Local overseers of the poor or boards of guardians were to decide which form of relief was more suitable to applicants. The Poor Law specified what the primary aims of poor relief were. First, to set to work able-bodied adults and children that were resourceless. Secondly, to aid non-able-bodied indigents that were sick, old or lame. But it was not clear whether the non-able-bodied were to be relieved at home or in a workhouse. Moreover, a moral categorization of the poor soon became apparent. Those who were believed to have become indigent through laziness or vice were singled out as undeserving, a stigma that can be traced throughout the history of poor relief up to the present. The recurrent problem of workhouse management was that all kinds of paupers were soon found to seek shelter in workhouses, although their positions and needs were different. For almost the whole of their history, workhouses took in young and old people, healthy and sick people, unemployed men as well as vagabonds, respectable widows as well as prostitutes. Consequently, they were very difficult to run. Poor law workhouses were first opened in the 1620s, mostly in the south of England. At that time, an economic depression urged the local authorities of cities like Salisbury, Gloucester, Plymouth, Southampton, Cambridge or Colchester to put to work unemployed or idle adults and children, conformably to the recommendations of the law. The motivation of these local authorities was often religious, combining the desire of moral reformation as well as the teaching of a work ethic. However, these developments were far from universal, and the political turmoil of the 1640s often led to their closure. It was towards the end of the 17th century that the number of workhouses increased considerably, as the majority of parishes now enforced the poor law. The Anglican movements in favor of moral reform, with societies like the SPCK, first encouraged the opening of charitable schools for poor children, then of workhouses financed by the poor tax. The improvement of the morality of the poor was the principal aim to be achieved through work discipline. In this respect, precise workhouse rules were drafted and printed for the benefit of inmates and the information of local taxpayers who financed these institutions. Another important development dates back to these years. From 1690 to 1720, about 15 large workhouses gathering the paupers of urban parishes were opened. So-called corporations of the poor, distinct from local authorities, were to run these places. They were first found in London and Bristol, later in towns like Exeter, Colchester, King's Lynn, Worcester, Plymouth and Norwich. Later in the 18th century, small workhouses continued to multiply throughout the country. A parliamentary report of 1774 suggests that there were about 1900 at that time. Yet the percentage of indoor paupers remained modest by comparison with the total of people on poor relief. In 1802, the percentage was about 8%, which meant about 83,000 individuals relieved over a year. However, in spite of this low percentage, about a quarter of poor law resources were spent on workhouses, according to official sources. And the hope of making profits from the labor of the inmates dwindled rapidly, as it was found that the produce of the work was less satisfactory than expected. In any case, from the 1780s, the rising cost of poor law expenditure in general alarmed the government, and the new ideas on political economy, for example those expressed by Thomas Malthus, suggested that paupers were merely social and economic parasites. All this led to the drastic amendment of the Old Poor Law in 1834. As is well known, it aimed at centralization, parsimony, and austerity. Individual parishes were gathered into parish unions, a new administrative unit. The Central Poor Law Commission, established in London, with the utilitarian Edwin Chadwick as its secretary, widely publicized its punitive principles in its annual reports, and bombarded the local guardians of the poor with recommendations concerning, among others, labor discipline, religious observance, the diet and the behavior of paupers. There were far fewer recommendations about their health and education. The official aim of the new poor law was to make the workhouse as repulsive as possible, while any other form of poor relief was withheld. However, it soon turned out that it was impractical and unpopular to suspend outdoor relief entirely, as the guardians of the poor revealed. In fact, the total cost of the poor law continued to increase, doubling between 1850 and 1900, especially as workhouses were expensive to run. Still, it was clear that workhouses now contained very few able-bodied men, except at times of economic crisis, and were rapidly becoming a hospital for the sick poor, a nursery for abandoned children, and a shelter for the elderly. This mixture of very different types of paupers in workhouses had not been entirely disregarded by the ruling elites and had induced some 18th century reformers to suggest the adaptation of workhouse architecture to their specific needs. And this is what I will now turn to, the workhouse as an architectural type. Until the middle of the 18th century, the smaller workhouses were hardly different from ordinary houses. But new architectural developments initiated about that time are worth discussing. One drastic solution was proposed by William Hay, an MP, as early as 1735. He suggested the juxtaposition of a hospital, a house of correction, and a workhouse in a newly created poor law district that would have the joint resources of a number of parishes. He explicitly wished to separate the impotent from those who are able to labor, and within this last category, to separate the innocent from the guilty. This in itself was an implicit condemnation of the existing workhouses where all kinds of inmates were indiscriminately brought together. Another, much cheaper proposal was to separate different types of inmates within the general workhouse. This is what was done to a certain extent in monumental houses of industry in East Anglia. From the 1760s, about 20 of these establishments were built under the patronage of the local gentry, worried about the rise of rural unemployment. They provided different quarters for men, women and children, as well as an infirmary, a surgery and a schoolroom. Yet what the poet Crabbe called pauper palaces were expensive to build and to run, and were not adopted universally. The most striking architectural innovation in workhouses came only after 1834, inspired by the example of new prisons, and new lunatic asylums. In 1777, John Howard had published The State of Prisons, recommending separated buildings for different kinds of prisoners, as well as particular attention to sanitary conditions of living. This book inspired the architect William Blackburn, who built a number of polygonal prisons with radiating plans and isolated courtyards, for example, at Northleach and at Liverpool around 1785. Similarly, the lunatic asylum opened at Glasgow in 1814, designed by William Stark, had a radiating plan and separate garden courts. What was at work in such buildings was really the adaptation of architectural distribution to new scientific or pseudo-scientific classifications of prisoners and lunatics. In a similar way, the strong interest of poor law authorities after 1834 in the classification of paupers led to an architectural revolution in the building of workhouses. The model plans elaborated by the architect Sampson Kemp Thorne and published in the Poor Law Report of 1835, whether square, hexagonal or rectangular, show similar radiating plans and sharply isolated quarters for men, women and children. In the following years, 320 new workhouses were built before 1841. From the outside, there were prison-like structures with forbidding entrances. Inside, they provided plain but relatively sanitary accommodation. The central position of the master's office might suggest the influence of Bentham's panopticon, but this resemblance is very superficial. The Benthamian logic of permanent and reciprocal surveillance in a transparent building simply was not at work in the new workhouse with its isolated and specialized quarters. During the Victorian and Edwardian ages, the number of workhouse inmates increased, in spite of the dissuasive effect of its austere regime. By 1905, there was an impressively large average of about 240,000 paupers relieved in workhouses. There were few able-bodied persons, and the general workhouses resembled more and more hospitals for the poor and homes for the elderly. In the larger and richer towns, the radiating plan was gradually abandoned after the mid-19th century in favor of huge barrack-like buildings not devoid of architectural ornaments. For example, the Fullwood Workhouse at Preston, opened in 1868, looked externally like a pauper palace and indeed cost the vast sum of £50,000. It is now part of the University of Central Lancashire. The punitive aspect of the 1834 reform was now clearly underplayed by local authorities, and the elaborateness of the architecture is possibly explained by civic competition between the richer cities. Up to this point, I have discussed institutional and architectural aspects of the English workhouse that both express the elite's understanding of what poor relief should be. Yet, what is far less easy to document is the actual conditions of life inside workhouses. And this is what I will turn to now. Until recently, only novelists, social explorers, and journalists had attempted to convey what these conditions could be like, sometimes in commiserating, sometimes in sensational fashion. Recent social historians have been more sober in their publications about pauper children and apprentices, about diet or medical care. But these concern mostly the 19th century, and only a handful of historians like Tim Hitchcock have attempted to explore earlier periods. Much work still needs to be done on workhouse masters, on schoolmasters and mistresses, on guardians of the poor, on workhouse buildings and more generally on 17th and 18th century workhouses. Inside each establishment, a master, sometimes called governor, reigned supreme in company with a matron who was often his wife. These people were public officers paid by the parish, unlike the guardians of the poor who were designated or elected by the local vestry. They were accountable for the good management of the workhouse in human and economic terms. Their social standing was low, as well as their salary, and some were hardly literate. It is no surprise that have left very few written accounts of their work. Moreover, they were sometimes looked down on by the clergymen and physicians who visited the poor and who did not necessarily agree with their way of running the places. For example, Dr. Joseph Rogers recounted in his memoirs his protracted conflicts with the successive masters of the Strand Union Workhouse in London in the mid-19th century. When he asked for better food for some inmates, or for better nursing or accommodation, he was considered a dangerous spendthrift and met sharp refusals. The perception of workhouse life by its inmates is even more difficult to document, especially for the 17th and 18th century. There were, of course, printed regulations that give details of working hours, standard diet, rules of conduct, and penalties for misbehavior. But these were drafted by the guardians of the poor or simply copied from other parishes, and they do not necessarily correspond to actual practice. Cohabitation must indeed have been difficult among such a mixed company of paupers, especially because workhouses, unlike schools, colleges or barracks, were communities without an aim, without a common purpose. Basically, the poor came to the workhouse in order to obtain food and shelter. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that the most common punishment for misbehavior was privation of food. Victorian sources indicate frequent complaining of inmates about bad food, especially the notorious gruel called skilly, and also about short weight portions. In most workhouses, cooked meat was served only at 3 meals per week. Ignoring official dietaries, the historian Alana Tompkins has studied actual expenditure in food in 3 urban workhouses in the middle of the 18th century. She concludes that inmates then had abundant but not sufficiently nutritive food. Still, village workhouses often had gardens or even farms annexed to them, and fresh vegetables and fruit were sometimes available to the inmates. This research would at least confirm that the Georgian workhouse was rather more eligible than its Victorian successor. As far as the health of residents is concerned, the reverse seems to have been true. There was hardly any concern for medical care in the 18th century workhouse. Babies were simply shipped off to uncontrollable wet nurses, and the sick and lame were often kept in the same rooms as the healthy. The first separate infirmary building was opened in London's Marylebone Workhouse early in 1792, with 300 beds for 1,000 residents, a figure which suggests a large proportion of sick people. It took another 3/4 of a century before a proper poor law hospital was opened in London in 1867. The quality of nursing was abysmal, since before the mid-19th century ignorant and illiterate pauper women played the part of nurses. For all these reasons, death was a very frequent occurrence in the workhouse, more so than in charitable hospitals. And its horror was compounded by the fear of the dissection of corpses. The education of children, on the other hand, was a matter of concern throughout the history of workhouses. However, the ability of reading the Bible was for many decades the only aim of reading sessions. As in the charity schools of the early 18th century, the most important aim of pauper education was then to teach common morality and acceptable manners. In any case, until the 19th century, the teaching was only performed by those paupers who could read. After 1834, some of the members of the Poor Law Commission, such as Edward Tufnell and James Phillips Kay, wished the education of pauper children to be more ambitious. Yet their opinion was far from generally accepted, especially in rural workhouses. Still, some schoolmasters and schoolmistresses were now salaried by parish unions. They were not always properly qualified and were often given more general supervisory work in addition to teaching. Like medical officers of health, they could have a difficult time with some masters of workhouses who were suspicious of their authority. And when from the 1850s some separate poor law industrial schools were open for pauper children, some trade unionists complained that their own children did not benefit from free state schooling. As far as discipline was concerned, it does not appear from judicial records that there was much serious violence inside the workhouses. This may be explained by the constant presence of a majority of women, children, and elderly people, less prone to physical aggression. It seems that violence rather came from outside, as when the first houses of industry of East Anglia were attacked by angry farmers in the 1760s, or when unemployed workers attacked and even invaded some workhouses in the north of England in the Chartist era, for example at Stockport. As to the question of violence between the inmates of workhouses, it is difficult to document, as it rarely involved the courts. Sexual harassment must have occurred too, especially when the segregation of the sexes was not yet the rule, but this is rarely mentioned in the sources. Much information on all these sensitive subjects seems irrevocably lost. On the kind of work performed in the workhouse, on the other hand, there is much more information, if only because poor law authorities like to remind the taxpayer of its existence, and also because Victorian reformers publicized its more repulsive aspects. Paupers were perceived by the elites above all as an economic burden for the community, and from the inception of the poor laws, overseers expected that the produce of their labor might to some extent alleviate this burden. The first justification of setting the poor on work was religious. St. Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians was endlessly quoted. "If any will not work, neither let him eat." In the late 16th century and early 17th century, Puritan theologians like William Perkins, as well as town magistrates, invoked this principle to justify the poor laws and its insistence on labour for the paupers. They said that the calling of each individual on earth was to follow a trade or profession. If he failed to follow this calling, he would no longer belong to the community of Christians. The need to reintroduce idle, able-bodied people, the notorious sturdy beggars, into this community was therefore declared to be a public duty. As Christopher Hill wrote, setting the poor on work promoted their spiritual welfare as well as added to the national wealth. The moral and religious justifications of public charity were less and less potent after the 17th century, and economic considerations had more weight. The political arithmetic of the late 17th century again strengthened this argument. Writers such as William Petty, Gregory King, Charles Davenant, and Josiah Child connected the growth of national wealth with the increase of the working population. In this sense, there was no fundamental distinction between the poor and the paupers, as all of them should be encouraged to work. For the paupers, working was in fact the precondition of their reintegration into mainstream society. The workhouse was therefore an appropriate instrument of this reintegration, as it was supposed to enforce work discipline. A few words now about the kind of work performed by workhouse inmates before the 19th century. The most common occupation for inmates was domestic work. As the majority of inmates were women, young and old, they were asked to work as cooks, washerwomen, needlewomen, nurses and teachers. Until the mid-19th century, there was no question of employing costly salaried servants, and workhouses were hoped to be as self-sufficient as possible. Clothes and shoes, hats and bonnets were produced on the spot, and spinning and weaving were staple activities in the workhouse. In fact, the more enterprising boards of guardians tried to start proper manufacturing in their workhouses, hoping to make some profit. As late as 1800, Frederick Morton Eden found that Shrewsbury Workhouse employed dozens of children, youngsters, men and women, in producing linen thread which was sold outside. Yet in most workhouses it was difficult to make profits from the labour of paupers who had little incentive to work, as they personally derived little or no advantage from it. And with the mechanization of the textile industry in the early 19th century, it was totally useless to try and compete with it. Moreover, the meaning of work gradually changed in line with the teachings of the new political economy. In The Wealth of Nations of 1776, Adam Smith had begun to describe work in terms of production of wealth, both for the worker and for the employer. For him, it was a means of exchange between free subjects, and no longer the providential destiny of the poor alone. In the industrializing society of 19th century Britain, people then worked less because they felt it was their fate, than in order to improve their lot and to become consumers in a competitive society. Conversely, for champions of economic liberalism like Malthus or Nassau Sr., idleness meant the choice of social marginalization. The able-bodied poor who did not or would not work were said to be hopeless outsiders in a changing world in which productivity and mobility were the key to success. As potential rebels, definitely undeserving, they were now hardly worth assisting, as their reintegration into mainstream society was believed to be impossible. The new Poor Law of 1834 translated this appreciation into a doctrine of segregation between respectable poor who were induced to stay outside the workhouse and dependent paupers who were described as irresponsible and morally degraded if they entered the house, in spite of the moral stigma that was now attached to it. Entering the workhouse in such a climate was the equivalent of a confession of failure. And the kind of work that was now to be performed in the workhouse savoured more of punishment than of regeneration. Oakum picking, stone breaking, or bone pounding were the staple activities for the few male able-bodied inmates. It is no surprise that fewer of them were found in workhouses after 1834. To some extent, one can say the new Poor Law achieved its object, at least in times of economic prosperity. On the other hand, it continued to accommodate the young, the old, the sick and the mad, although its punitive ethos was totally inadequate for such categories. By the middle of the 19th century, the central Poor Law authorities began reluctantly to admit that a number of specialized institutions could cater for their needs. Orphanages, industrial schools, poor law hospitals and lunatic asylums gradually allowed some paupers to escape the horrors of the general workhouse. But as the members of the Royal Commission on the Poor Law discovered in 1906, general workhouses were still very common at the beginning of the 20th century. Their elimination was very slow and was not completed until after the First World War. I will now conclude on the apparent paradox of the workhouse that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. That institution was both detested by the poor and criticized by political elites for its cost and inefficiency. And yet it lived on for more than 3 centuries. Surely it must have had some advantages on both sides. From the point of view of the elites, one might imagine that it was an instrument of social control, allowing local government to come to terms with potential rebels without making a crime of poverty. On the other hand, nobody was forced to enter the workhouse, and this means of social control was necessarily very imperfect. I think it is more at the level of discourse that the workhouse was useful to the ruling classes. Providing relief in exchange for work had strong justifications in Protestant England in terms of religion, morality, and economy. The recourse of indigents to the workhouse could therefore be publicized as an impeccable form of social contract that could be acceptable to the taxpayer and would contribute to the social order. In his perceptive study of the poor, published in 1907, the German sociologist Georg Simmel wrote, "Assistance does not aim at relieving the poor, but at relieving poverty." By this he meant that society, by relieving indigents, above all wished to remedy an economic disorder in its midst. The sustained defense of the workhouse by the elites was ultimately justified by the public interest, even in its punitive period. As for the poor, they must also have found some advantage in entering the workhouse, in spite of its unwelcoming regime. As we have seen, it was for some of the more desperate a question of life and death, and survival must have been their essential motivation. Of course, they disliked the tasks that were forced on them, and they were understandably reluctant to perform them. Yet the popular perception of the poor law was that poor relief was an unwritten right of the free Englishman, and, detestable as it was, the workhouse was part of a system to which the majority adhered. In the last resort, the work imposed in the workhouse had 2 basic functions in the polity. It had a discursive usefulness for the elites, as it helped them defend the existing order, and for the indigents it was a lesser evil, quite simply the price to pay for their survival.